Some moments in history are so astounding, so full of courage and sacrifice they seem like scenes from a Hollywood script. And in some cases, they became exactly that. These are the real-life events that were so powerful, they leapt off the battlefield and onto the silver screen. From one-man liberation missions and medics who braved gunfire without a weapon, to pilots who made the ultimate sacrifice. These are the true stories behind some of the most unforgettable war films ever made. We begin with our first story, which recounts a bold World War II river assault that became a turning point in one of the conflict's most ambitious operations, dramatically recreated with over 1,000 real soldiers in the epic war film A Bridge Too Far. After the 1944 Normandy landings, the Western Allies broke through the German defenses, retaking large areas of captured territory. By late summer, High Command devised a new operation, one that could potentially end the war before Christmas. Dubbed Operation Market Garden, the offensive was a combined airborne and armored operation. The British 1st Airborne Division, the 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade, and the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would drop over strategic locations in the Netherlands to secure important bridges, while the British 30 Corps would advance, crossing over the captured bridges and entering Germany from the north. The 82nd Airborne Division, under the command of Brigadier General James Gavin, was, among other objectives, to secure the bridges that spanned the Vaal River at the city of Nijmegen, a rail bridge and a road bridge. During the German advance across the Low Countries, the bridges were destroyed, but were repaired by German engineers. It was vital for the success of Market Garden that these structures be captured intact. On September 17, 1944, Operation Market Garden commenced. After landing, the paratroopers rushed to secure their objectives. Seeing the approaching 82nd, the Germans destroyed several smaller canal bridges, though at least one was captured. They then made a push towards Nijmegen and the vital bridges there, but were delayed preparing for a rumored 1,000 panzers in a nearby forest, which proved to be untrue. When they entered the city, the Americans were greeted as liberators by the Dutch inhabitants, but celebrations were cut short when the Germans counterattacked. The German commander, General Walter Model, had sent reinforcements in the form of the 10th Panzer SS Division to keep the bridge out of Allied hands. A fierce battle ensued, and with the German reinforcements, the 82nd Airborne would be unable to capture the objective. They needed the support of the British armed forces, though the plan for Market Garden necessitated that the bridges be captured before they arrived. On September 19th, armored units from the Household Cavalry arrived at Nijmegen, and a conference between General Gavin and General Brian Horrocks occurred. It was concluded that a frontal assault on the bridge would be too costly. Instead, Gavin proposed what sounded like madness. Both the north and the south sides of the bridge would be attacked simultaneously, with a combined attack by British tanks and American paratroopers. The biggest hurdle, however, was that the Allied forces were on the south side of the Vaal River, a 400-yard-wide tributary of the Rhine with a swift current. As a solution, Gavin proposed that the paratroopers cross the river by boat about a mile downstream, attacking the Germans on the north side of the bridge at the same time as the main assault from the south. Skeptical, but without an alternative, Horrocks agreed to the plan, which was scheduled for the next day, September 20th. At around 8:30 the next morning, the Allies launched the attack, the first objective being the securing of Nijmegen on the south side of the river. While this was underway, the 3rd Battalion, 504th Regiment, prepared for their amphibious operation, covered by Sherman tanks from the Irish Guard and artillery from the Leicestershire Yeomanry. The plan ran into complications almost immediately. Reinforcements from the 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, scheduled to arrive, were delayed due to poor weather at their base in Britain, depriving them of much-needed manpower. Furthermore, the boats needed for the mission were provided by British engineers, but these were slow in arriving since Hell's Highway, the thin artery of supply, was a narrow roadway with constant jams and destroyed vehicles obstructing the flow of traffic, and the boats arrived late. When they did arrive, the paratroopers were underwhelmed, to say the least. Made from canvas and plywood, something more suited for fishing and a leisurely pond than conducting an amphibious operation on one of Europe's largest rivers. Nevertheless, the 3rd Battalion set up the boats, 13 men plus 3 engineers each, and began the crossing. As the men slid into the water, the tanks, supported by artillery, began to provide covering fire, launching smoke screens to cover the paratroopers. In addition, a flight of 8 RAF Typhoon fighters strafed the north bank in anticipation of the landing. In spite of these preparations, disaster struck. The men were paratroopers, not Marines, and had little experience with waterborne operations. The overloaded boats became bogged down in the muddy banks and were difficult to dislodge. Others pushed their boats out into deeper water to keep from getting mired, climbing in after, but many capsized and had to be righted, while the swift current of the Val caused some boats to drift out of control. Eventually, enough boats were able to begin the crossing in earnest, but the smokescreen had dissipated more quickly than had been hoped, and the Germans on the far bank opened fire with machine guns and mortars. Major Julian Cook, leader of the 3rd Battalion, was in the lead boat. A devout Catholic, he prayed the rosary with each stroke of his paddle, the tempo of his prayer setting the pace for the rest of his men with him. The effectiveness of this improvised sea shanty was limited by the lack of paddles. The men improvised, using the butts of their rifles, their hands, anything to get across. With such floundering targets, German machine guns, tanks, and mortars began picking off the struggling paratroopers, blasting the canvas boats with everything they had in their arsenals. Holes were torn into the flimsy hulls, and the survivors used their helmets to bail out the onrushing water and stuffed cloth into the leaks in a desperate attempt to stay afloat. Of the 26 boats to make the first trip, only 11 made back to the southern shore for the second wave. Those that didn't make it across still had major obstacles in their way. The main German position was a dike on the far end of a 1,200-foot wide field. After catching their breath, the men fixed bayonets and charged. There was a brief firefight with the few Germans there, clearing this defensive strongpoint. While this was going on, the rest of the battalion made their crossing, with the bulk of the 3rd Battalion on the north side of the Val. They made their way to the railroad bridge. After destroying several German positions, the north end of the rail bridge was secured. More intense fighting would ensue, but eventually the northern portion of the Val Bridge would also be captured. At the same time, Nijmegen was steadily being captured by the British armed forces and American paratroopers, who sometimes fought from rooftop to rooftop. By the evening, both ends of the bridge were in Allied hands. The SS tried to destroy the span with place demolition charges, but these failed to explode. It's alleged that Jan van Hoof, a member of the Dutch resistance, had disabled the charges days earlier, though this is impossible to confirm. British tanks were now able to cross the Val River, their objective the city of Arnhem, about 10 miles away, where elements of the British 1st Airborne and 1st Polish Parachute Brigade were being pressed by a German counterattack. Instead of moving onward to relieve them, however, the British tanks dug in, having been ordered to hold the bridge at all costs, and no further instructions to race to Arnhem were issued. Due to a combination of factors, ranging from the approaching night, the arrival of German reinforcements, logistical issues, and pockets of German resistance in the Nijmegen area, the push towards Arnhem was delayed. When they heard about this, the paratroopers were enraged, having performed the crossing in broad daylight, sacrificing their lives under the impression that every moment counted instead of waiting for darkness. During the crossing and subsequent fighting, 134 men of 3rd Battalion and their attached engineers were killed, wounded, or missing, more than half the unit. There was little they could do, however, except fortify their holdings and await further instructions. Eventually, after a few more days of fighting, it was determined that Arnhem was too difficult to hold on to, and that the Allies should consolidate their front line around Nijmegen, the paratroopers at Arnhem breaking south towards their allies. Although still hotly debated to this day, ranging from the 82nd failing to capture the bridges before the tanks arrived, the failure to push to Arnhem, logistics and communication breakdowns, weather and other reasons, Operation Market Garden was ultimately a failure. In spite of this, the memory of the heroic men who fought lives on. 40 years after the battle, a monument honoring those who fell was erected. In 2013, a third bridge across the Val was dedicated, called the Oversteek, or the Crossing. It has 48 lights, one for each man who fell trying to reach a bridge too far. Our second story takes us to Nanjing, China, during the brutal 1937 massacre by Japanese troops. In an unexpected turn, John Rabe, a German businessman and Nazi party member, saved over 200,000 Chinese civilians by creating a safety zone. His story resurfaced with the 2009 film John Rabe, which was banned in Japan due to its portrayal of wartime atrocities, underscoring just how controversial his legacy still is. 1937. It's the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War. The Japanese, Nazi Germany's soon-to-be allies, are readying their assault against the people of China, leading to one of the darkest and most brutal points in Chinese history, the Nanjing Massacre. Japanese soldiers are pillaging and attacking unarmed men, women, and children throughout the city, racking up a body count in the hundreds of thousands. But one man in particular stands defiantly against them, a barrier between the Japanese soldiers and the Chinese people they're brutalizing. John Rabe, a businessman who manages Siemens China Company, is putting aside his own safety to try to save over 200,000 citizens who are flocking to his protection. The catch? Rabe is a German Nazi party official. He should be supporting the Japanese, not standing in their way. So the question remains, why is a Nazi standing against his supposed allies and protecting the very people they targeted for destruction? John Rabe was born in Hamburg, Germany in 1882, but spent most of his adult life in his beloved China. In 1937, the Japanese invade China, bringing the conflict to his doorstep. The threat to Nanjing builds. The city of Nanjing is about to fall. Germans and American officials are fleeing, leaving only a small handful behind. John Rabe is one of them. He believes that to flee would be to mark the Nazi Party, a party in his eyes that supports the poor, as hypocrites, and so he remains. From September to November 1937, John Rabe is protecting his employees with his authority. His diaries almost cheerily discuss bombings and their dugouts, all while enjoying tea and his continued friendship with the Chinese citizens. But as the Japanese creep ever closer to Nanjing, plans begin to take shape. First, Rabe joins the International Committee, composed largely of American doctors and professors. Their purpose? To figure out how to save the city from the inevitable, looming invasion. By late November, only 3 officials from the German embassy remain in China. Rabe is elected chairman of the International Committee, and together they propose a large safe zone to cover much of Nanjing. Their plan is to guide unarmed civilians into these protected areas where the Japanese would agree not to harm them. But the Japanese soon refuse to put any formal agreement in writing, claiming they cannot agree to it knowing that soldiers had crept into the safe zone. But despite his long tenure in China, Rabe still believes there are people in Germany who will listen to his pleas. With the Japanese bearing down, he sends 2 telegrams. One to the General Consul Kriebel, requesting he support Rabe's petition to Hitler. The other to Hitler himself, asking him to intercede with the Japanese government and grant permission for a neutral zone for non-combatants, given the immediate battle for Nanjing. He receives no reply. In the meantime, Rabe also receives instructions from the embassy to leave Nanjing. He replies politely but firmly, refusing and restating his intention to stay and protect over 200,000 non-combatants. By November 27th, the city gates of Nanjing are closed. The safety zone is set up, and Rabe is overseeing its general management and operations, including medicine, food, and transport. A week later, air raids begin and Chinese civilians moved into the safety zone. John and his committee wait. Stuck between various countries' political maneuverings, the committee continues to funnel supplies into the safe zone, amid falling bombs and the promise of looming ground troops. Despite promises that the zone is for refugees only and not military personnel, on December 5th, the commandant of the city's defenses, General Tang, greets Rabe from a house within the safe zone. 5 days later, the Japanese radio announces Nanjing will soon fall. A diary entry by a Mr. Smith speaks of over 1,000 dead in one night at the city's south gate and hundreds more within the safe zone. Further entries tell of the horror of a brutal and unfiltered attack from the soldiers against civilians. Bodies litter the streets, and Rabe frequently stumbles across violent scenes that fill him with horror. At one point, he tries to negotiate with the Japanese. If Chinese soldiers abandon their arms, will they not treat them fairly? The answer, he finds out, is no. By the time the Japanese soldiers enter the safe zone on December 13th, Rabe's diaries are filled with stories of the daily atrocities he witnesses. As the number of dead grows, so too do the staggering numbers of women violently attacked inside the safe zone, and across the city looting increases from both Japanese and Chinese soldiers. But among the horror in the pages are moments of shining humanity. Throughout, Rabe shares stories of how he and his American fellows drive off Japanese soldiers with their mere presence, how his garden fills with over 300 refugees who consider his house the safest spot in Nanjing, how he physically removes Japanese invaders from his home, and how he refuses to let harm come to those who have sought shelter under his wing. Although Rabe admits it's significantly easier for him than the Americans, all he needs to do is point to his swastika armband and shout Deutsch or Hitler to get them to flee. On Christmas Eve 1937, his diary entry simply states, "I do not regret having stayed on here, for my presence has saved many lives, but all the same, my suffering is indescribable." Throughout the Nanjing massacre and razing of the city, Rabe and others continually write reports on what they witnessed. For Rabe's part, he seems sure those outside China aren't aware of the scale of the atrocities that were occurring. By mid-January 1938, Nanjing is being razed to the ground and successfully taken by the Japanese. Rabe believes no one remains outside the 200,000-strong safe zone, and those inside are struggling, with food shortages and violent attacks from soldiers continuing. On February 8th, the Japanese and Autonomous Government Committee announced the end of the invasion and immediate disbandment of the safety zone. Rabe tells those who have taken refuge in his garden that he would never make them leave, but he can also do little to protect them if the Japanese come in force to evict them. In the end, the true toll of the Nanjing massacre remains unknown. Rabe estimates between 50 to 60,000 dead, but modern sources are much higher, placing between 200 and 300,000 lives lost. He leaves Nanjing on February 23rd, a hero to its residents, beloved by the refugees he saved, and with the nickname, the Buddha of Nanjing. He never stops thinking about what he witnessed there, writing yet again to Hitler and enclosing a copy of a lecture he gave telling the truth of what he witnessed in Nanjing. But he also claims these records were only meant for documentation and not public consumption. In time, Rabe is arrested by the Gestapo and the Soviets on separate occasions, although both times he's released without incident. While mentions of Hitler or the Nazi Party are scarce throughout his diaries, he always writes of them commandingly and with a surface-level air of approval. However, after, he rarely speaks of Hitler or the Nazi Party again. His biographer later concludes that he had no interest in them or their politics. Whether that was because of the response at and after Nanjing or not is unknown. In the last years of the war, Rabe finds himself in Berlin, poor and living in his son-in-law's spare room as a pariah of Germany, the consequence of saving lives of the enemy. John Rabe dies of a stroke in Berlin on January 5, 1950, but his legacy lives on, with monuments to his bravery both in Germany and in China. In the end, for John Rabe, it was never about Hitler's shining vision, Nazi Party ideology, or being a member. It wasn't even about being German. What it all essentially came down to, and why he decided to stay in Nanjing, despite orders to the contrary, was one simple truth. He was a human being, and so were they. And bound by that shared humanity and his love for the people of Nanjing, he simply could not leave them behind. It was all so obvious. None of it has anything to do with heroics. The focus of our third story is the legendary Huang, whose heroic act of wartime sacrifice became a powerful symbol of national pride. His story was immortalized in Ying Guang, part of China's main melody film tradition that honors patriotic heroes. The Chinese hero of the Korean War, Guang. The Korean War is often overshadowed by the Second World War and other conflicts of the 20th century, which has given the conflict the unfortunate moniker of the Forgotten War. While both North and South Korea and their allies fought fiercely for control of the Korean peninsula, heroes emerged on both sides of the conflict, and no matter what uniform they wore, their deeds are worthy of remembrance. Guang was born on January 18, 1931, in Zhongjiang County in the Sichuan province in central China, the son of poor farmers in the rural countryside. Little is known of his childhood or upbringing, but what is known is that he was raised in a tumultuous time in Chinese history. In 1927, civil war broke out between the Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party, plunging the nation into 2 decades of brutal war. To compound the already chaotic situation further, in 1937, the ever-expanding Empire of Japan also invaded the country. After the Japanese were defeated and driven out of China in 1945, the Civil War continued to rage until 1949, when the Communist Party emerged victorious. A year later, in 1950, Chinese forces entered the ongoing conflict in Korea, throwing their weight behind their fellow communist North Korean allies in their struggle against the UN-backed South Korea adversaries. In March of 1951, Guang joined the People's Volunteer Army, an expeditionary force of the People's Liberation Army that was sent to Korea, and was sent to the fighting shortly after. During this stage of his military career, he proved himself to be a capable and resilient soldier who earned recognition for his abilities. His first assignment was to act as a runner, a task for which he excelled, earning commendation for his efforts, earning the Meritorious Service Third Class Award. In late 1952, the United Nations forces began Operation Showdown, a major offensive into North Korea, hoping to gain an advantage during peace negotiations, which were breaking down. It was hoped that a major victory would force the North Koreans and the Chinese back to the table under more advantageous conditions. 2 divisions, supplemented by heavy support from the U.S. Air Force, would launch an incursion into the Iron Triangle, a vital junction of Chinese and North Korean communications. The Chinese forces quickly sent reinforcements to blunt the UN offensive, dispatching the 15th Corps, which Huang's unit was attached to, as well as the 12th Corps. The bulk of the fighting occurred at what was called Triangle Hill, officially designated as Hill 598 by the Americans and their allies, and known to the Chinese as Shangganling, a forested piece of high ground that roughly resembled a V when viewed from above, with a pair of ridge lines extending out from it. Adjacent to Triangle Hill was another piece of high ground dubbed Sniper Ridge. Both of these locations would be the main objective for the American-led UN advance. On October 14th, the battle began and would see some of the fiercest fighting of the Korean War. After an intense aerial bombardment, the UN forces advanced behind the screen of a sustained rolling barrage from hundreds of artillery pieces. All but the deepest dug-in Chinese positions were obliterated, and the lines of communication between their forces were cut, throwing the PLA troops into disarray. Still, they fought fiercely, holding every inch of ground with stubborn determination. The attacking UN troops were met with a hail of gunfire, as well as a wide array of explosives, including hand grenades, Bangalore torpedoes, shaped charges, and whatever else was at hand. When these limited stocks of munitions were depleted, they resorted to throwing rocks at the advancing enemies. In spite of their desperate efforts, the Chinese lines on both Sniper Ridge and Triangle Hill were being pushed back. Sniper Ridge would eventually be captured by UN forces. The situation was different on Triangle Hill. Though they suffered heavy casualties, Chinese forces at the apex of Triangle Hill managed to withstand the onslaught, and the attackers' momentum was stalled. Taking advantage of the reprieve, on October 19th, the commander of the 15th Corps ordered a counterattack. Liu Litai, a member of Huang's unit, recalls the heavy fighting he encountered as they made their advance against the UN troops, who were also heavily dug in, stating, quote, The machine guns swept across our trenches. I laid low every time I heard machine gun fire. They were pointed right at us. I ran that way. I avoided being shot in the head by just one step. The shrapnel sliced through my arm and my shoulder." End quote. The key objectives of the Chinese counterattack were a series of blockhouses and other fixed emplacements. Though low on ammunition and explosives, they pressed on, capturing several of the positions. According to Liu Lutai, Huang was at the enemy forefront, using one of the remaining Bangalore torpedoes to help destroy an enemy blockhouse. In spite of this initial success, their advance was halted by a fortified blockhouse that was designated Position 0. Fire from this location was so intense that any attack against it ended in failure. In order to continue the assault, a demolition team of 3 men was called up. The hastily assembled plan was incredibly simple. The 3 men would close with the blockhouse and destroy it with explosives, allowing the rest of the pinned men to continue their push into the enemy lines. Guang was one of these 3. As the 3 made their way to Position 0, they came under heavy fire. One of the men with Huang was killed outright. The other one was badly wounded and unable to continue. Knowing his comrades were relying on him to succeed, Huang pressed on alone, closing to within 15 meters of the objective. Once there, he threw his last grenade, hoping to destroy the blockhouse. Instead of destroying it, however, the grenade fell short before it detonated, covering the firing slit with debris, obstructing the field of fire for the men at the machine gun. With a lull in the firing, the rest of Huang's company rushed forwards. Before they could close with the enemy, however, the blockhouse defenders managed to clear the obstructions and resumed their firing. A number of the advancing company were killed, and the attack was once again stalling out. Seeing his fellow soldiers being cut down, Huang once again leapt into action. He shouted something to his fellow soldiers, though the words were drowned out by the deafening gunfire and explosions. He then rushed forwards and threw himself onto the slit, blocking it with his own body and preventing the machine gun inside from firing on his comrades. His sacrifice was not in vain. For a few precious moments, with the firing slit obstructed with Huang's body, Position 0's gun was silent. With this linchpin of their defense temporarily out of action, his fellow soldiers were able to close with and destroy the blockhouse. In some accounts, Huang's actions are directly attributed to a 1947 Soviet war movie, Private Alexander Matrosov, which is based on the real-life exploits of Soviet soldier Alexander Matrosov. Matrosov performed a similar action, obstructing a German pillbox with his body in 1943, allowing his fellow Red Army soldiers to advance. The fighting would rage around Triangle Hill for several weeks afterwards. In total, the battle for Triangle Hill would rage for 42 days. Reported casualty figures vary wildly depending on the side, but all agree that the numbers were high. No matter the actual numbers, Operation Showdown was a failure for UN forces. For his heroism, Guang would be posthumously awarded the title of Combat Hero Second Class, which would be upgraded to Combat Hero Special Class, and was also given membership to the Communist Party. Huang's North Korean allies would confer on him the title of Hero of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, a Gold Star Medal, and a First-Class Medal of National Flag. Guang is virtually unknown outside of China, though within the country, he is a national hero. His actions were immortalized on propaganda posters and has become a symbol of self-sacrifice and dedication to duty. Today, the headquarters of the People's Liberation Army Air Force Airborne Corps, which was reorganized from the 15th Infantry Corps, of which Huang was part of, also has a memorial hall dedicated to this hero of China. No matter what uniform was worn or what flag they marched under, soldiers of all nations who participated in the Korean War fought with bravery, distinction, and self-sacrifice, and no matter the cause, are worthy of remembrance. In our fourth story, we look at one of the fiercest battles of World War II, where combat medic Desmond Doss saved dozens of lives without ever carrying a weapon. His extraordinary bravery was finally brought to the big screen in Hacksaw Ridge. When the film was released, Doss's son, Desmond Jr., attended a screening and was moved to tears by Andrew Garfield's portrayal of his father. The medic who fought a war without a weapon. Desmond Doss was not your average hero.
He would become a Medal of Honor recipient, the United States of America's highest and most prestigious military award, as a combat medic who saved many of his comrades' lives in battle without firing a single shot, because he didn't take a weapon into combat because of his religious beliefs. Desmond Doss was born in 1919 in the state of Virginia and was raised as a strict Seventh-day Adventist, a Christian denomination that believed that Saturday was the Sabbath and that the second coming of Jesus Christ was imminent. They also believed strongly in nonviolence and a healthy diet, based typically on a vegetarian diet. Doss had been raised with a strict belief in the Bible, and when it came to the Ten Commandments, he took them to be the core values of how to lead his life. When World War II started, he was conflicted as he believed the war was a just one, but he felt that to kill another human being under any circumstance was wrong. He was already employed as a joiner at Newport News Naval Shipyard, but nevertheless he joined the United States Army on April 1, 1942. He could have requested a deferment, but he wanted to do his patriotic duty. He was assigned to an infantry unit, the 77th Division, and presumed that his classification as a conscientious objector would not require him to carry a weapon. For Doss, one commandment of the Bible stuck with him the most: "Thou shalt not kill." He wondered why he was assigned as a rifleman and not in a medical role. His commanding officer tried to pressure Doss into carrying a weapon, as they thought he would be more of a liability than an asset in combat, but Doss refused. Interestingly, even for medics, which Doss would later become, it was common practice at the time to carry either an M1911A1 pistol or M1 carbine for self-defense purposes. The rules go that a medic under the Geneva Convention is not forbidden from carrying a weapon, but if a medic fires his weapon, he stops being classed as a medic, and therefore can be legitimately fired upon by the enemy. The regimental chaplain, Captain Stanley, would soon understand Doss's protests and helped him transfer from rifleman to medical training. To make matters worse, his fellow soldiers mocked his religious beliefs. When he was reading the Bible daily and strictly observing the Seventh-day Adventist tradition of attending church every Saturday, Doss continuously requested to be allowed to have Saturdays off rather than Sundays in order to follow his Adventist beliefs that Saturday was to be observed as the Sabbath. In the end, Captain Stanley took this up with divisional headquarters, and it was decided that Adventist soldiers would have Saturdays off, just as the other men had Sunday off. This in fact made Doss even more unpopular than ever with his fellow soldiers, as he was seen to have it easy. As he had Saturdays off, none were on base on Sundays to see him pull extra duties to make up for this. One of the squad's other soldiers summed up the company's feeling about him and his Saturdays off, complaining, "You get more passes than the general." As Doss was a strict vegetarian at a time when it was unusual, it meant that the rest of the unit viewed Doss with such distrust and hostility that one man in his unit even warned him ominously, "When we go into combat, Doss, you're not coming back alive. I'm going to shoot you myself." Doss eventually became an Army combat medic, saying, "While others are taking life, I will be saving it." The turning point for Doss and his relationship with his company came with their first 25-mile march with full field pack and rifle, something they were expected to achieve in 8 hours. The other soldiers thought Doss would be having it easy as he would be carrying no rifle or ammo that day, but his 2 canvas medical bags were almost as heavy and much more awkward to carry than any rifle. As the march progressed, the men started to suffer from exhaustion. Numerous blistered feet and dehydration, some even passed out. And all the time there was Doss, always with a helping hand, even to the extent that at the end of the march, he insisted on checking everyone's feet and administering medical aid where it was needed. By the end of that day, he had won the respect of his entire unit for his tireless devotion to his duty. For the first time, he was treated as one of their own. Doss, as the qualified combat medic of the unit, was now responsible for providing first aid and frontline trauma care on the battlefield. He would be assigned to accompany his unit into the war zone and be there with them on the front line at all times. This was soon to happen, for the 77th Division had had their first combat experience on May 11, 1943, and Doss and his comrades were urgently being trained up to replace the combat losses and help expand the division's strength. The 77th Division would end up being in combat officially for no less than 208 days, suffering a total of 9,212 casualties before the war would end. The Battle of Guam. Doss's first taste of combat was at the Battle of Guam, which was a bloody battle fought from July 21st to August 10, 1944, to recapture the U.S. territory of the island of Guam from a determined Japanese garrison of nearly 20,000 troops. Though according to the Geneva Convention, knowingly firing at a medic wearing a clear insignia is a war crime, the Japanese snipers and machine gunners tended to ignore this and saw combat medics as easy and valuable targets to gun down. So medics in the Pacific Theater were often told to avoid wearing medical insignia in case it would make them more, not less, of a target. Doss was under fire nearly every day during the battle and was busy doing his part in saving lives. Guam had shown Doss how cruel war could be. As his unit was pushing forward through the jungle on their first day, a young, fresh-faced recruit spotted a fountain pen laying on the jungle floor and went to pick it up. Before anyone could warn him otherwise, a white phosphorus grenade exploded. The pen had been booby-trapped. The young man who had picked up the pen, his chest now a bloody mess, had blood pouring out of an open wound. Severe burns and sharp metal fragments covered his body, and he was going into shock. By some miracle, Doss managed to stabilize his condition, administering care and helping to evacuate him and 3 other soldiers who had been wounded by flying red-hot shrapnel. This was Doss's first taste of combat casualties. The U.S. casualties during the battle was truly appalling. Of the 59,000 U.S. troops who took part in the invasion, around every 1 in 6 were either killed or wounded. The Battle of Leyte. Next, Doss and his unit was involved in the Battle of Leyte in the Philippines that ran from October 17th to December 26, 1944. A vicious and prolonged battle which started with a huge U.S. coastal bombardment and amphibious landing, followed by heavy fighting the more inland the Americans went. During a Japanese counterattack, a fellow medic, Clarence Glenn, had heard the call for a medic from a machine gunner. He left the cover and went into the open, into no man's land, to get the wounded man, and was himself hit. Glenn was Doss's friend from back home and he couldn't leave him there. So he and a litter bearer, Herb Schechter, went out to find the 2 wounded and dealt with them separately. Doss was attending the machine gunner who had a gash along his face while bullets whizzed overhead. Both of the wounded were alive. They made an improvised litter out of a poncho and tree branches to get the wounded men back to the aid station. But his friend Glenn would die before he made it. From this point on, Doss would not look at the face of the men he was treating in case it was another friend. Sadly, his friend Herb would be shot and killed when he and Doss were carrying a litter as their silhouette exposed them against the sky to the enemy. On top of losing his friends, Doss was constantly hungry because the meat in the K rations conflicted with his vegetarianism, so he could only eat the tasteless crackers and coconuts he found. On Leyte, the coconuts on the ground gave him diarrhea, so he climbed the trees for fresh ones. At one point, Doss was looking for coconuts. It attracted poorly aimed Japanese machine gun fire. When they were killed by American soldiers, it was later discovered that they had been drunk on sake. One thing that shocked Doss during the most devastating times of the campaign was that the same man who had made threats towards him during training at Fort Jackson now came to him for guidance and to pray for him. The Battle of Okinawa. And lastly, for Doss and the 77th Infantry Division was a battle that was to be the bloodiest battle of the war in the Pacific, as well as its largest amphibious landing. The U.S. objective was to secure the island as a base, as it was just 350 miles south of the Japanese mainland and would be strategically crucial for any future invasion of Japan. The battle started on April 1st, 1945, exactly 3 years to the day that Doss first enlisted in the Army, and the battle was to last 81 days. Doss was assigned to the 1st Battalion as their combat medic. On April 29, 1945, the 77th Division was given the task of assaulting on a 400-foot-high cliff called the Maida Escarpment. This was nicknamed by the Americans as Hacksaw Ridge. Before they climbed the cargo net, Doss said a prayer for his comrades. When Doss's unit joined the assault, and as they neared the top of the escarpment, they came under intense Japanese artillery, small arms, and machine gun fire, inflicting severe casualties on the assaulting American troops. The American forces had sent in wave after wave of troops to try to dislodge a fanatical enemy base there who were well entrenched and camouflaged. On May 4th, While his unit was attacking a heavily fortified enemy position at the mouth of a cave, Doss went to the aid of 4 of his injured comrades. The lieutenant who led the attack on the emplacement had intended to throw a grenade when an enemy bullet hit him and delayed it, blowing his hand off and wounding his comrades. Despite having to get within 25 feet of the enemy lines and under attack by enemy grenades and gunfire, Doss managed to get to the injured men. He then managed to evacuate the men back to his own lines, one by one. During the night, the Japanese continued to throw grenades and kept up the mortar fire. The American soldiers hid in rock crevices, but the Japanese found ways to infiltrate and sneak up on them. Then, on the next day, May 5th, he came to the rescue of a wounded artillery officer who had gone to see how the artillery guns were doing. Doss's left leg was now injured, as he had fell the day before down the edge of a parapet. He climbed up the cargo net with his first aid kits, his weight falling on his bad leg. Finding him in a shell hole, the officer had been struck by shrapnel that had made a hole from his chest to his back, and Doss could hear him breathing through it. He was bleeding heavily. Doss gave him first aid while under constant enemy gunfire and shelling. He put the dressings over the large holes in the colonel's chest and back, and administered blood plasma which dangerously exposed Doss to the enemy, as he had to hold it up high. Doss's efforts here would be in vain, as the colonel, carried back on a stretcher, died before he reached the aid station. Later, there were orders to take a vital Japanese pillbox position on the reverse slope of a hill that was holding up the American advance. Desmond Doss, once he had read his prayers, was happy to support the assault. The American troops threw gasoline cans at the position, which triggered a large explosion. All of a sudden, a large Japanese counterattack overwhelmed the American soldiers, causing them to panic and rush back to the edge of the cliff. But despite this, Doss refused to take cover, and while constantly under heavy fire by the enemy, though being totally exhausted, he spent hours carrying the wounded one by one to the edge of the escarpment. Then, to get the more severely wounded down, he tied a rope to a tree stump and lowered them down the cliff on a rope-supported stretcher to safety. When the stretcher kept slipping, he turned to a new method, looping the rope around the wounded men's chest and legs to lower them down. Doss, standing, exposed to potential enemy fire, was seen praying at the cliff edge as the men were being lowered down. And later he had said he had been praying to the Lord to help him get one more, and after that, one more, until they were all down. Calculating the wounded men at the base of the cliff, the captain worked out that Doss had saved around 75 men. The Americans would eventually go back up the cliff and on May 7th would take the position. By some miracle, Doss survived the whole battle totally unhurt, but that was soon to change. On May 21st, in the confusion of a night attack, Doss tended to the American wounded, risking being hit by both the Japanese and by friendly fire. Doss was in a shell hole with another American soldier when a grenade landed beneath him. His reflex action was to put his foot on it and was seriously wounded in both legs, as blood poured out from the impact of 17 pieces of shrapnel in his body. But he remained in his position for 5 hours, tending to himself while also helping others who were wounded, until a medic and a pair of litter bearers could get to him. But that was not the end of it that day, for as he was being stretchered to safety, they got caught in an enemy tank attack. As they took cover, Doss spotted a critically injured man and insisted that he be taken back on the stretcher instead of himself. While Doss waited for the litter bearers to return, he was found and helped back by a fellow soldier. Suddenly, Doss was hit by a Japanese sniper's bullet and suffered a compound fracture to his arm. The two men took cover in a shell hole. Realizing how badly injured he now was, Doss instructed the soldier on how to bind his rifle stock to his shattered arm to act as a splint. Eventually pushing through excruciating pain, he would make it back to the aid station. The U.S. Army recognized Doss's extreme bravery, and he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his heroic and selfless actions at Okinawa from April 29th to May 21st, 1945. Because of his heroic actions, many wounded men made it back home. Desmond Doss would go on to run a small family farm with his wife Dorothy, and lived to the age of 87.
Next, we shift to the Congo, where a group of Irish peacekeepers, isolated and outnumbered, held their ground against a massive assault. Their long overlooked stand was brought back into the spotlight by the Netflix film The Siege of Jadotville, which added an extra layer of authenticity. Some of the Swedish Carl Gustaf M45 submachine guns used on set were the very same weapons carried by Irish troops during the actual conflict, confirmed by serial numbers.
The Siege of Jadotville, September 13th through the 17th, 1961. The Siege of Jadotville from September 13th to the 17th, 1961 was a forgotten military action of the Irish UN peacekeeping forces during the Congo crisis. It's the story of 155 soldiers of the A Company, 35th Battalion of the Irish Army, who fought against an enemy that outnumbered them for 5 days while kept under siege in the hostile region. Because they surrendered only when they were left without water, food, and ammunition, the document of their heroism was kept under the carpet for more than 50 years. The Congo crisis began in 1960, the same year when the country declared independence after almost a century-long Belgian rule. After only a few months, the central government lost control over the country as Katanga, led by Prime Minister Moise Tshombe, declared its independence, later followed by Kasai, Oriental Province, and Leopoldville. Katanga was of greater importance to the future of the Congo, as it was the wealthiest portion of the country due to its huge mining resources. Without the capacity to deal with secessionists and the Belgian army that still had not left the country, the government of the Republic of the Congo, led by President Kasavubu and Prime Minister Lumumba, called the United Nations for help. In July 1960, the United Nations Operation in the Congo, or ONUC, was formed. UN peacekeeping forces from Africa, Asia, and Europe were deployed across the entire country with a task to monitor the withdrawal of Belgian troops and protect the civilian population. The Irish contingent, along with the Swedish and Indian soldiers, were sent to the disputed region of Katanga. The UN headquarters was established at the province's capital, Elizabethville. HQ deployed a detached unit to the 80-mile-away distant town of Jadotville, with the task of protecting the local Belgian population. Jadotville was a town of great strategic importance because of the nearby Shinkolobwe mine. It was a mine with the largest uranium deposits in the world. And it was this mine that provided the uranium needed to make the Hiroshima and Nagasaki A-bombs. Even though the UN forces were responsible for protecting the local population, it was obvious they were not welcome. Neither natives nor Belgians who supported Katanga secessionists looked with favor on the UN base in the town. The commander of A Company, 35th Battalion of the Irish Army stationed in Jadotville, Commandant Pat Quinlan, was very well aware of the situation. As a measure of precaution, he ordered his men to build a defensive perimeter around the entire base. They were told to dig deep trenches, stockpile water, and carry their guns at all times. The following days would show how good this preparation was. On September 13, 1961, ONUC launched an offensive named Operation Morthor against the forces of the state of Katanga. This action meant that the UN directly sided with the Central Congo government. The Katangese response was immediate, as if they knew about the UN offensive before it happened. What was to be a quick offensive lasting 2 hours to resolve the secession once and for all, in fact lasted from September 13th to the 21st, and was the moment in which a peacekeeping mission turned into a war between the UN and the Katanga. On the same day at 7:40 a.m., while almost all Irish soldiers were attending Mass, Katanga Gendarmerie attacked the Jadotville base. Luckily for the Irish soldiers, they were noticed by Private Billy Reddy, who was on guard duty that morning. Private Reddy fired a warning shot and alerted the whole unit. As the Irish soldiers in the base were ordered to always carry their weapons, they manned their positions instantly. The Katangan gendarmeries attacked the UN base with a force between 3,000 and 4,000 men. The majority of them were inexperienced soldiers from the local Luba tribe, while there were also a lot of Belgian settlers and battle-hardened mercenaries from France, Belgium, and Rhodesia. They were armed with a wide spectrum of various light weapons and supported with 81mm mortars and French 75mm MLE 1897 field guns. They even had air support from a modified Fuga Magister training jet. The jet had machine guns added as well as underwing bombs, which proved crucial in the assault on the Irish peacekeepers. Katangese forces were financed by the Anglo-Belgian mining cartel Union Minière de Haute-Katanga, a covert international company that was responsible for supplying most of the world's copper, cobalt, and uranium. The base was defended by almost 160 Irish soldiers armed only with light weapons. The majority of soldiers were armed with FN FAL self-loading rifles and British Lee Enfield No. 4 rifles. They were also armed with a few Bren light machine guns, Swedish Carl Gustaf light machine guns, and Vickers machine guns. The support platoon was armed with 60mm mortars. The Irish, however, had the advantage of the supreme commanding ability of Major Quinlan. The way he led his men through 5 days of the siege was nothing less than ingenious. When the assault began, the Irish soldiers' alertness and defensive perimeter enabled them to repel the first attacking wave with ease. The first attack was followed by a few hours of silence, after which a new wave followed along with bombardment with mortars and field guns. Once again, the well-entrenched Irishmen managed to withstand the attack with only a few soldiers wounded. What Major Quinlan realized on the first day was that his perimeter was too wide. Under the cover of night, he withdrew his men inwards to a new position where they dug new trenches. The new position allowed the Irish to hold a better defense, especially because it was elevated and allowed them a complete overview of their surroundings. The following morning started with a new barrage, but on the previously abandoned trenches. That same day, the attackers called in the air support. When the enemy Fuga Magister flew over the base, the Irish soldiers thought it was a UN plane. Moments later, the jets started bombing the Irish positions, destroying their vehicles and preventing them from making a retreat. Attack after attack in waves followed. Even though the Katangese gendarmes managed to get closer to the perimeter, the Irish managed to repel every single attack, inflicting heavy casualties on their enemy. The Irish mortars also managed to silence the Katangan artillery. As their strength severely diminished, the Katangans asked for a ceasefire. Major Quinlan agreed, as he too wanted to buy some time and allow UN reinforcements to arrive. The headquarters at Elizabethville sent a reinforcement of 500 Irish, Swedish, and Indian Gurkha soldiers to relieve soldiers at Jadotville, but these were fought off on their way to Jadotville by mercenaries in Katangese service. The besieged soldiers did receive help in water supplies. A helicopter carrying water landed into the base under intense fire. However, the water was undrinkable because it was stored in petrol containers. As time passed, the situation for the Irish soldiers worsened. The Katangese forces broke the ceasefire and continued their attacks. The Irish soldiers were slowly coming to the end of their ammunition and, even worse, food and water. Since Major Quinlan had not been receiving messages from his HQ about reinforcements or orders on what to do next, he decided to surrender. But before the surrender, his men had killed 50 mercenaries, more than 300 Katangese gendarmes, and wounded 1,000 more. Irish casualties were totaled at only 5 wounded soldiers. After 5 days of combat, they simply had no more capacity to continue the fight. On September 17th, Major Quinlan made an agreement with the Katangans to cease fire in Jadotville. The agreement, however, ended with the disarmament of Irish soldiers, who were then sent to captivity. During the first 3.5 weeks of captivity, the Irish soldiers were treated well. The Katangans did not want any bad publicity. Their intention was to exchange the prisoners for a UN promise of a ceasefire. When the gendarmerie took over supervision of the Irish POWs, their treatment worsened significantly, but the captured Irish were eventually exchanged for Katangese soldiers held by the United Nations. Upon release, the soldiers of the A Company 35th Irish Battalion returned to Elizabethville, where they stayed until the end of their rotation. In December 1961, they returned home to Ireland after being relieved by the 36th Irish Battalion. Instead of being welcomed with laurels, soldiers from Jadotville were met with condemnation. Despite the fact that A Company managed to fight off the much more powerful enemy, Army officials disfavored the fact that Major Quinlan eventually laid down his arms. The fact that the unit was left without ammunition, food, and water, and that the command structure was the one that failed, was ignored. Only after more than 40 years, men of A Company of the 35th Battalion were given credit for their bravery during the Siege of Jadotville. Major Quinlan was posthumously relieved of all allegations of soldierly misconduct. In November 2005, a monument was unveiled to the brave soldiers of A Company of the 35th Battalion in Kustum Barracks, Athlone.
Our next story recounts when a mission went wrong in Somalia and 2 soldiers volunteered for a last stand defense, an intense real-life moment recreated in Black Hawk Down, a film so committed to realism that actual U.S. Army Rangers trained the actors and even appeared in the movie themselves.
We got a Black Hawk going down. We got a Black Hawk going down.
Roger, bird down.
A U.S. convoy is being delayed after being forced to navigate through the streets of Mogadishu in Somalia, overcoming obstructions placed by Somali militia. While waiting for their arrival, Somali fighters begin to converge on the area, with a hovering Black Hawk helicopter presenting a perfect target. One opens fire with an RPG, 16-20 hours. The RPG round slams into one of the Black Hawks, call sign Super 6-1, piloted by Chief Warrant Officers Cliff Wolcott and Donovan Briley, which begins to spin out of control, plummeting to the ground. Both men are killed on impact, and the rest of the crew are seriously wounded. Immediately, the operation shifts to a rescue mission, with U.S. forces diverting to the crash site. In the early 1990s, famine gripped Somalia, and relief efforts were continually thwarted by intense clan violence. In 1992, a U.S.-led peacekeeping effort, Operation Restore Hope, was initiated, attempting to bring humanitarian aid to the African country. In spite of these efforts, warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid continued to attack UN workers. In response to this, Operation Gothic Serpent, later known as the Battle of Mogadishu, was launched to capture or eliminate Aidid and his top commanders. On October 3rd, based on intelligence gathered about a meeting between Aidid and his lieutenants at the Olympic Hotel, Task Force Ranger, which was made up of members of the 75th Ranger Regiment, Delta Force operators, helicopter crews from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, and other Special Forces personnel, launched a snatch and grab mission. It was a simple plan that should have taken 30 minutes. That's when things spiraled out of control. 16-40 hours. With attention occupied on the downed chopper, things would go from bad to worse. About 20 minutes later, another RPG round hits a different Black Hawk, Super 6-4, piloted by Chief Warrant Officers Mike Durant and Ray Frank. Clipping the tail rotor, the helicopter initially manages to stay aloft, but then the rotor assembly disintegrates, which sends the Black Hawk plummeting to the ground. The falling helicopter crashes into a group of huts before careening to a halt. At the point of impact, Durant was knocked unconscious. Regaining his senses sometime later, he sees Frank sitting at the door of the crashed Black Hawk, pushing himself out. That was the last time he would see his co-pilot. The fate of the rest of the crew at this point is unknown. Durant is unable to move, the impact fracturing his femur and crushing several vertebrae. Resigned to his fate, he takes off his helmet, gloves, and watch for reasons he couldn't explain, and preparing to defend himself as best he can, he raises his MP5 and waits for the worst. It was now that he received some unexpected help. Master Sergeant Gary Gordon was born in 1960, growing up in Lincoln, Maine. He joined the Army at the age of 18, and after an assignment with the 10th Special Forces Group, he joined Delta Force. Sergeant First Class Randy Shugart was born in 1958 in Lincoln, Nebraska. He enlisted in the Army while in high school, eventually earning his Ranger tab before leaving the service. He would re-enlist as a Ranger before being assigned to Delta Force. During Operation Gothic Serpent, both men were to stay airborne, riding in Black Hawk call sign Super 6-2, providing sniper cover while the operation was underway. When Super 6-4 was shot down, most of the attention is concentrating on reaching the crash site of Super 6-1. With a large number of Somali militia converging on the wreckage of Super 6-4, a relief column is sent to reach the crash site, though this is turned back due to heavy resistance, as is another force sent by the 10th Mountain Division. 16-42 hours. With no one to aid the downed Black Hawk, Gordon and Shugart asked to be inserted to protect the survivors. Their request is denied. It's stated by their commanders that they will be more useful providing air cover. More to the point, though, were the odds. A pair of Delta snipers against what seemed like half the city? Everyone knows it would be a one-way trip. They ask a second time, knowing that with each passing moment, the downed crew's chances were slipping away. A third time they ask, and finally, their request is approved. Super 6-2 lands about 100 yards from the crash site, and Sugart and Gordon leap out. A third man in their team, Sergeant First Class Brad Hawlings, stays aboard the Black Hawk, using the door-mounted minigun to cover them from the air, taking over from the crew chief who has been wounded. When they reach the crash site, Gordon and Sugart move Durant from the helicopter and arrange the other members of the crew as best they could into a defensive perimeter, though there are some reports that they are already dead by the time the Delta snipers arrive. Durant was under the impression that they were about to be rescued and that a convoy or helicopter would be picking them up shortly, though this was not the case at all. Super 6-2 continues to circle the crash site, the minigun wielded by Hawlings providing what cover he could, until that Black Hawk is also hit by an RPG and small arms fire. Hawlings had his leg blown off, and both the pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Mike Gofina, and co-pilot Jim Yaccone are also wounded. With severe damage inflicted to the helicopter, they're forced to withdraw from the fight. Without this air cover, Gordon and Sugart had to rely on their own weapons to fight off what seemed like the entire city. As members of Delta Force, they had much more leeway to choose their weapons than other soldiers do. Gordon used a CAR-15, a short-barreled version of the M16, chambered in 5.56. Sugart wanted something more substantial, so he went into battle with an M14, a much older battle rifle, but had the advantage of being chambered in 7.62, which has much more stopping power, and it has a simple aim-point sight to improve his accuracy. These, along with their sidearms, were the only things protecting the downed Black Hawk now. The next series of events are unclear, since Mike Durant was the only witness, but what is clear is that Gordon and Sugart fight ferociously, keeping the Somalis at bay despite being vastly outnumbered. Their training as marksmen makes them proficient shots, but the numbers facing them force the two to expend their ammunition at an incredible rate. With Durant doing what he can with his MP5, the battle continues as ammunition runs low. In the middle of the fight, the men rummage through the crashed Black Hawk, gathering every round and functioning weapon they could get their hands on. But this wasn't enough. There are frantic calls on the radio for help, and there are some indications that a reaction force is on the way, but this never materializes. 1740 hours. There's some controversy as to what happened next. Official reports claim that Sugart was killed first, and that Gordon gave Durant his rifle with the last few rounds in it. Others claim that Gordon was hit first. Durant was given a CAR-15, and it's highly unlikely that Sugart would give away his prized M14. And at least one witness remembers hearing Sugart over the radio at this point. Either way, one of the two is killed, and the other picks up the fallen rifle, handing it to the paralyzed Durant. He simply said, "Good luck," and then turned back to the fight. A few moments later, Durant hears Sugart cry out in pain and then falls silent. It's been reported that 24 Somali fighters were killed by Gordon and Sugart during their last stand, with many more wounded, though this is impossible to confirm. The mass of Somalis swarmed over the crash site, and Mike Durant is taken captive. He would be released 2 weeks later. For their willingness to sacrifice themselves to save their fellow soldiers, Master Sergeant Gary Gordon and Sergeant First Class Randy Sugart would posthumously earn the Congressional Medal of Honor, the first recipients of the medal since the Vietnam War. They would also receive numerous other awards, which included having the mock-up city at the Joint Readiness Training Center named after them. During the course of the battle, 18 Americans lost their lives, and many more were left wounded. Yet amid the chaos, Gordon and Sugart stood tall, just two among the many brave men who would step forward when destiny called. In our 7th story, we delve into the incredible tale of Hiro Onoda, a man whose unwavering loyalty and prolonged isolation continued long after World War II had ended. His story is powerfully portrayed in the film Onoda, 10,000 Nights in the Jungle, an international co-production involving France, Japan, Germany, Belgium, Italy, and Cambodia, underscoring the global fascination with Onoda's extraordinary journey.
Hiro Onoda, the Japanese soldier who didn't surrender until 1974. Hiro Onoda was a Japanese intelligence officer in the Imperial Japanese Army who refused to surrender until decades after World War II had ended. In the Pacific Theater, there were many Japanese holdouts holding Zanryu Nipponhei, or remaining Japanese soldiers. They were motivated to continue on after the surrender of Japan in August 1945 because of their dogmatic, militaristic indoctrination or simply because they were unaware of the surrender. Hiro Onoda was trained at the Nakano School as an intelligence officer, where he was taught guerrilla warfare and intelligence gathering. Onoda was sent to Lubang Island near Luzon in the Philippines in late 1944, where he would soon meet up with a group of other Japanese soldiers already on the island. Mijiyoshimi Taniguchi had given him orders to live off the land and forbade him to die by his own hand. He would further reassure Officer Onoda by saying, "It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. Until then, so long as you have one soldier, you are to continue to lead them." Higher-ranked officers in the group made Onoda unable to carry out his mission to sabotage the enemy airstrip and pier at the harbor. This in turn made the U.S. conquest of the island, which was achieved in February 1945, easy. Once U.S. forces were on the island, the large group split up into smaller groups of 3 to 4 men and escaped into the jungle and were either picked off by the U.S. troops or surrendered until it was just Hiro Onoda and 3 others under his command which were left active. Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, all of which had set up base in the mountains. After Japan had formally surrendered in September 1945, Onoda and his group came across a number of leaflets. The first leaflet, left behind by locals, was discovered quite soon, reading, "The war ended on August 15th, come down from the mountain." However, they concluded that it was an Allied propaganda trick. After this conclusion, the group continued to raid local islanders for food and other resources. General Tomoyuki Yamashita of the 14th Area Army also dropped leaflets from the air with a surrender order, but again the group decided that they were a trick. With a lack of knowledge of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it may have seemed more unlikely that Japan was willing to surrender. In 1949, Yuichi Akatsu escaped from the group and surrendered to Filipino forces in 1950, causing the remaining 3 to be cautious to disloyalty. In 1952, the search mission was expanded with letters and pictures from the group's families dropped from an aircraft, but again, this was wrote off as a trick by the 3 soldiers. Every piece of evidence the group came across increased their paranoia and hostilities. While they were dressed in their Imperial Japanese uniforms, the people they came across were in civilian clothing, which they interpreted as Allied soldiers in disguise, with the strategy of luring them out. As a result, they didn't think twice when firing on the locals. Corporal Shoichi Shimada was shot in the leg but recovered with the help of Onoda in 1953. But on May 7, 1954, he was killed by a search party when he fired upon his potential rescuers who returned fire on a beach at Gunton. Now just 2 remained. Onoda and Kozuka would continue the mission to sabotage, gather intelligence on, and attack the enemy, which no longer existed. But on October 19, 1972, during a skirmish, Kozuka was shot and killed by the police when he was burning a farmer's rice collection. Lieutenant Onoda was now alone. On February 20, 1974, a determined Japanese explorer called Norio Suzuki found Onoda. Onoda still refused to surrender. However, Suzuki had the idea to locate his original commanding officer, Mijiyoshimi Taniguchi. In March 1974, his former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Tamaguchi, traveled to the Philippines to fulfill his promise to return and end his orders in person. Onoda, still wearing his tattered army uniform from decades ago, saluted the Japanese flag and handed over his samurai sword, his functioning Arasaka Type 99 rifle, several rounds of ammunition, hand grenades, and his family dagger. The Philippine government under President Ferdinand Marcos granted him a pardon, taking into consideration that although he had killed 30 innocent people during his campaign on the island, he thought the war was still carrying on. When he returned to Japan, Onoda was very popular, but he found it hard to adjust to the new post-war Japan and the decay of its traditional values. He published an autobiography and in 1975 left Japan for Brazil, where he raised cattle and later opened a series of training schools. In his last years, Hiro Onoda said in an interview, "Every Japanese soldier was prepared for death, but as an intelligence officer, I was ordered to conduct guerrilla warfare and not to die. I became an officer and I received an order. If I could not carry it out, I would feel shame. I am very competitive."
Our 8th story soars over the skies of Korea, where 2 Navy pilots formed an unshakable bond in the heat of battle. The film Devotion brings this powerful true story to the screen with striking realism, using 6 authentic F-4U Corsairs for its thrilling aerial scenes. Heroes of the Korean War, Jesse Leroy Brown. In 1950, the Korean War began when North Korea invaded South Korea, and the Eastern and Western blocs quickly chose sides. The Western, hoping to stem the communist tide that was threatening to overwhelm the South, sent armies to meet the North Koreans and their allies, the Soviet Union and China, on the battlefield. With them were troops of all races, including some of the first African-American naval officers. One such man was 21-year-old Jesse Leroy Brown, who had dreamed of being an aviator since he was a young boy. His story encapsulates the bravery and tragedies seen every day on the battlefield. Jesse joined the Selective Flight Training Program at Glenview in 1947, receiving positive reports from his teachers. Throughout his training, Jesse experienced severe racism. Nevertheless, the unacceptable treatment didn't deter him from his goal of becoming an aviator. Plus, he had a secret. Despite the rules forbidding it, Jesse had secretly married his girlfriend, Daisy, finding support and a lifeline in the letters they exchanged. In 1948, Jesse Leroy Brown made history as the first African-American aviator to earn his wings in the U.S. Navy. Jesse became an ensign to the Leapt, a naval aircraft carrier that held 80 to 100 aircraft and 115 pilots. He had been there almost a year when in November 1949 he met his soon-to-be wingman, Thomas Hudner. In later years, Hudner spoke extensively about his time with Jesse and how others on board the ship perceived him. He claimed that they didn't see color and Jesse was just one of the guys. Yet in the same breath, he admits that there were members of the fleet that were so, quote, anti-black as he called it, that they refused to acknowledge Jesse's existence, unless it was to insult it. Hudner himself, though, speaks of his former comrade with respect and deference, calling him a real gentleman and noting that the black stewards on board idolized him, quote, deservedly so. Together, they became part of the 32nd Fighter Squadron, flying F-4U-4 Corsair planes, with Jesse later becoming section leader. He flew 20 air combat missions in total across Korea, with his squad at some points completing 2 every 3 days. It was brutal, exhausting work. Tragically, the flight Jesse Leroy Brown took on December 4th, 1950 was to be his last. The Chosin Reservoir was the site of one of the most significant battles of the Korean War. With Chinese and U.S. forces meeting on the frozen and icy lakefront, it was a hard conflict with every U.S. aircraft available providing support, including Jesse's squadron. On December 4th, however, Jesse Brown's team had a different mission, reconnaissance. Flying over the mountainous and difficult terrain as high as 6,000 feet, the squad of 6 kept each other in their sights as they looked for targets to report. 45 minutes later, Jesse's voice crackled through their radios.
I think I've been hit. I'm losing power, and I'm gonna have to land.
What Hudner later noted was how calm Jesse stayed throughout the whole ordeal. While his team supported him, Jesse looked for a safe place to land, but with the pine tree-covered mountains, it seemed an almost impossible task. Nevertheless, Hudner kept talking, making sure Jesse was following the right steps and protocol as he went down, praying for a safe escape.
Shoulder harness locked. Lock canopy open. Be careful of airspeed to avoid stalling.
Between these instructions, his squad mates tried to direct Jesse to a clear area, realizing his best and only option was to ride the plane down. But it was impossibly hard, and despite their efforts, Jesse's plane hit the mountainside at speed, bending the cockpit around 30 degrees due to the force of the landing. The canopy's lock didn't withstand the force of the crash, causing it to slam shut. From the air, it looked like the pilot couldn't have survived. A helicopter was radioed for, and to the team's temporary relief, they saw Jesse pull off the canopy, waving at them from the plane's wreckage. For all intents and purposes, he looked largely unharmed, but the engine was smoking dangerously and he appeared trapped. Hudner assessed the situation and believed it would take one quick tug to pull Jesse free. The only problem was, he hadn't received any order to do so. And he decided not to wait for them either. It was 15 degrees and snowy. Hudner realized that Jesse probably couldn't wait for the official order or the helicopter to arrive. freezing to death was a very real, immediate problem. In that moment, Hudner made an incredibly brave decision. Despite the lack of permission, he made the choice to crash land his own plane next to Jesse's in the hopes he could save him. In the years since the Korean War, Thomas Hudner spoke several times of the hours he spent on that freezing mountainside with Jesse. By the time he reached him, scrambling onto the wing of the downed plane to reach the cockpit, Jesse's hands were already frozen and he had lost his head protection on the way down. He was trapped, his legs pinned by the cockpit and control panel. Quickly, Hudner realized his plan to pull him out would be futile. Wrapping a scarf around Jesse's hands and placing his own hat on his head for warmth, Hudner ran back to his own plane, radioing the helicopter to bring a fire extinguisher for the engine and an axe to cut Jesse free. The two men could do nothing but wait and talk. During this time, Jesse asked Hudner to tell Daisy how much he loved her. Hudner made some futile attempts to throw snow on the plane's cowling to stop the engine from smoking, to little effect. Conversation was punctured and stiff. Hudner later said he didn't know whether it was simply because it was a difficult time to carry on a conversation, or if the icy cold was already causing Jesse to slip in and out of consciousness. But throughout, Jesse Brown remained, in Hudner's own words, unbelievably calm. If anything, he supported Hudner, staying matter-of-fact and logical, simply saying, "We've got to figure out some way out of here." Around 40 minutes later, the helicopter and Lieutenant Charles Ward arrived, but tragically it was to no avail. The fire extinguisher failed to work properly, and the axe had zero effect on the cockpit. Jesse remained trapped and largely silent, his body shutting down from the cold. Unfortunately, they were at an impasse. The helicopter simply wasn't equipped to fly such difficult terrain in the dark, and it was getting dark. Ward realized what had to be done. Devastatingly, they had to leave Jesse behind. Although he gave Hudner the choice of staying on the mountainside, at that point, it would have been tantamount to suicide. But Hudner went back to Jesse, assuring him they would get more equipment and return. Deep down, he knew Jesse wouldn't survive the cold that long. If he was even still alive now, he seemed unconscious. Jesse Leroy Brown died on that mountainside near the Chosin Reservoir on December 4th, 1950. He was the first African-American aviator casualty of the Korean War. Later, he posthumously received the Purple Heart and Distinguished Flying Cross. But the war wasn't over for Thomas Hudner. Arriving back on his ship 3 days later, the captain offered to send a helicopter with a flight surgeon to retrieve Jesse's remains from the downed aircraft. It was a generous and rare offer, but one Hudner refused. It was simply too dangerous. Instead, fighter planes dropped napalm on the crash site, giving Jesse a funeral pyre on the mountainside. Now, over 70 years later, Jesse's remains are still up on that mountainside, despite multiple attempts to retrieve them. Hudner also later reported that people were annoyed at him for his choice to crash land on the mountain. In doing so, he endangered himself, the lieutenant, and disobeyed direct orders from a captain who didn't want to lose any more planes than necessary. But in Hudner's own words, he was a hell of a lot more important than an old broken-down World War II airplane. Jesse Leroy Brown was a hero, and a man who many aspired to be like. In the words of his wingman, the words of a man who recognized what Jesse meant to African Americans everywhere and the unfathomable tragedy of his loss. He was in the van of those leading his people across the threshold of equal rights and acceptability. He was destined to spread his influence throughout society as he grew. He died in the wreckage of his airplane with courage and unfathomable dignity. He willingly gave his life to tear down barriers to freedom of others. The subject of our 9th story lost both legs in a flying accident, yet fought his way back into the cockpit. Portrayed in Reach for the Sky, where the actor Kenneth Moore wore aluminum casings to reflect the real-life challenge.
Douglas Barter, the flying ace with no legs. Douglas Barter was a pilot in the Royal Air Force who would go on to pilot fighter planes in the Second World War without his legs and claimed 22 aerial victories, becoming a flying ace. Barter joined the RAF in 1928 and graduated in 1930. And in late 1931, at age 21, he was assigned to a squadron flying Bristol Bulldogs at Woodley Airfield near Reading. While flying the Bulldog, he went against orders not to do aerial acrobatics or fly below 2,000 feet. Nevertheless, Barter performed an aerial stunt to show off his skill, resulting in his plane crashing. Both of his legs were crushed under the twisted wood, canvas, and metal. With no way of saving them, they had to be amputated, one above the knee and one below. After this, Barter had to learn to walk again using artificial legs. Doctors were not hopeful that he would be able to walk without a stick, but Barter was determined, and he wanted to fly again. After being transferred to RAF Hospital Uxbridge, Barter learned new skills with his new legs. He learned to drive a racing car, played golf, tennis, and dance. During this time, he also met his future wife, Thelma. From 1937 to 1939, with World War II on the horizon, Barter requested several times to rejoin the RAF, but was refused piloting roles on the grounds that there was no incorporating his disability. Air Vice Marshal Hallahan recommended that Barter do the Central Flying School to test his abilities, which he passed. This would also familiarize himself with the newer, modern planes. Barter noticed how the planes had upgraded significantly. Gone were the biplanes, replaced with new low-wing monoplanes such as the Hurricane and the Spitfire. While in his Avro Tudor during the training, Barter couldn't resist doing a stunt, turning his biplane upside down at 600 feet. By 1940, Barter would be posted to the No. 19 Squadron and put in a cockpit of a Spitfire, undertaking convoy patrol missions. During this time, known as the Phony War, he wouldn't see much action, but soon he would be posted to No. 222 Squadron, where he would see action over Dunkirk during the Battle of France, protecting the Royal Navy and evacuating the British Army below from the Luftwaffe. During this combat, he took down a Messerschmitt Bf-109 and damaged a Heinkel He-111 bomber. Barter noticed that his disability gave him a distinct advantage when piloting his plane during dogfights. Because he didn't have legs, he was less likely to black out from the effects of G-force. Usually, this would cause blood to flow from the brain to other parts of the body, such as the legs, causing loss of consciousness. This meant that Barter could pull off tight turns and outmaneuver his opponents. After Dunkirk, Barter was transferred to No. 242 Squadron and promoted to squadron leader. This squadron, which was made up of Canadians, was low on morale due to heavy casualties during the Battle of France. At first, they were not welcoming to their new leader and were puzzled by his disability, but he would soon rebuild the squadron's morale and inspire them with his courage and skill. They would fight in the Battle of Britain and see major action on the 30th of August 1940, when the squadron took down 12 enemy planes, 2 of which were shot down by Barter. By the end of 1940, with the Battle of Britain over, No. 242 Squadron had shot down 67 enemy aircraft, with 5 pilots killed in action. Barter would leave the squadron in March 1941. He was promoted to wing commander and leader, escorting bombers during daylight raids at a Spitfire Mark 5A as part of the circus operations. Taking on enemy Bf-109s with his squadron, sometimes at dangerously low heights, his score would rise to 20 confirmed as destroyed plus 2 shared. On August 8th, Barter noticed a formation of 12 enemy fighters and dived on them, taking out one and possibly colliding with another Bf-109 or shot down by it, sending his Spitfire diving into the ground in flames. While trying to bail out, one of Barter's artificial legs became stuck. However, he was able to escape from the cockpit just in time. When he landed, he was captured by the Germans and taken to a hospital in St. Omer as a prisoner of war. The Germans had great respect for Barter because of his courage to fly without legs. Flying ace Adolf Galland asked the British to airdrop Barter a replacement leg, which they did. Shortly afterwards, Barter tried to escape the hospital using a rope made from bedsheets so that he could climb down from the window. He was eventually caught, however, after being betrayed. Barter was now on a Luftwaffe-run prisoner of war camp known as Stalag Luft III. He had made so many escape attempts that the Germans guarding the camp threatened to take away his artificial legs. In 1942, while in Stalag Luft 8B, Barter and several others tried to escape, but the alarm was raised when a Luftwaffe officer came to visit Barter and he was not there. Soon, he was recaptured. He was then transferred to the escape-proof Colditz Castle on the 18th of August 1942, where he would spend the rest of the war. And on April 15, 1945, the prison was liberated, and Barter was freed by American troops.
And finally, our last story features Alvin York, who tried to avoid combat as a conscientious objector, but ended up one of America's greatest war heroes, capturing 132 German soldiers almost single-handedly. The film Sergeant York dramatized his journey, and it was such a hit that it became the highest-grossing film of 1941, helping to boost U.S. morale just months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. The reluctant man too good at killing, Alvin York. When the United States entered the First World War, many jumped at the opportunity to join the fighting. Others, however, were sent to the trenches against their will. Of these reluctant warriors, some would rise to the occasion and become war heroes, in spite of their hesitancy to fight. Perhaps the most famous American who served in the Great War was one of these men. Alvin Cullum York was born on December 13, 1887, in Pall Mall, Tennessee, the third of 11 children. His family was impoverished, and York only had 9 months of total formal schooling before working as a laborer and blacksmith to support his family. In order to put food on the table, he was also an avid hunter, a skill that would serve him well in the future. York also had a wild streak, which included frequent run-ins with the law. By 1915, however, he turned aside from his hedonistic ways and became a member of the Church of Christ in Christian Union. After his conversion, York became a devout follower of his new faith and became a respected member of the church community. In 1917, the United States joined the First World War, which had been raging for 3 years. In order to fill the ranks quickly, the government instituted a draft, and on June 5, 1917, York received his conscription notification. Due to the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," York claimed conscientious objector status. This request was denied 3 times, and York was officially inducted into the U.S. Army. York was sent to Camp Gordon, Georgia, for training, and was attached to the 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Infantry Division, nicknamed the All-American since it had members from all the 48 states at that time. Throughout his time in training, York proved himself a capable soldier and an excellent marksman, though he still couldn't reconcile his beliefs with the duties of a soldier. He brought his concerns to Major Edward Buxton, his battalion commander. Rather than dismiss York, Buxton engaged in an hours-long debate, both men pointing to scripture supporting their views. York focusing on passages about turning the other cheek and other passages advocating nonviolence, while Buxton quoted verses supporting combat, selling one's cloak to buy a sword, and obedience to earthly authorities. York left the meeting still committed to his pacifism, but gave serious consideration to Buxton's arguments. While on leave, he prayed and fasted for guidance and became convinced that he should do his duty and fight, regardless of his own personal misgivings. With a clear conscience, York and the 82nd Division were sent to France. Most notably, York participated in the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, which began on September 26, 1918, the largest single campaign ever conducted by the U.S. military, with over 1 million men participating over the course of the 47-day fight. After years of fighting, the Germans were highly experienced and built an elaborate network of defenses to hold the ground they had taken. The inexperienced Americans threw themselves into the meat grinder, and their attacks stalled out. On October 8th, members of the 2nd Battalion, 328th Regiment, 82nd Infantry Division, including newly promoted Corporal Alvin York, were sent to reinforce positions at Hill 223, pushing against heavily entrenched Germans. They managed to force the Germans off of the hill, but to continue the advance, they would have to enter a steep valley with no discernible cover. To complicate matters further, the Americans on the left and right flanks were stalled out by stubborn resistance, leaving the battalion to advance alone. If that wasn't enough, the battalion was advancing to the northwest, though earlier that morning orders were changed and they were supposed to attack due west. The runner carrying the order was killed before delivering the message, leaving the unit unsupported. York's platoon began their attack against the German lines, led by Lieutenant Kirby Stewart. As they reached the center of the valley, Stewart was hit by a burst of machine gun fire and killed. turning command over to Sergeant Harry Parsons. Parsons noted that on the left of their advance were German machine gun positions and ordered 17 men, including Corporal Alvin York, to silence them. Making their way around the German positions, they stumbled upon elements of the Prussian 210th Reserve Infantry Regiment, which had been moved up as reinforcements. The Germans were resting after a forced march the night before and had set their weapons aside when confronted by the Americans. Caught off guard, the Germans surrendered. On a nearby hill, German machine gunners noticed what was happening and swung their weapons towards the Americans. They shouted for their countrymen to get down before unleashing a torrent of fire on the Americans, hitting both the doughboys as well as their fellow Germans. Of the 17 Americans, 6 were killed outright and 3 were wounded. While some of the remaining troops guarded the POWs, York was now the senior NCO of the remaining 8 that were capable of putting up resistance. York advanced to a better position, about 50 yards from the Germans. Laying prone, York began to fire into the German machine gun crew and supporting riflemen. There is some controversy as to what rifle York used. Some suggest that he was armed with a Springfield M1903, chambered in .30-06. Even his statue in Nashville, Tennessee depicts him wielding this firearm. It was more likely, however, that he used an M1917 Enfield, a version of the British Pattern 14 Enfield, which was modified to fire the .30-06 cartridge. These had been made by American firearm manufacturers for years for use by the British, and it was easier to convert these for American ammunition than to make enough M1903s. Regardless of the type of rifle he wielded, he did so with devastating effect. Years of hunting experience made York adept under pressure, and he eliminated the machine gun crew and a number of riflemen with methodical efficiency. All the while, York repeatedly called out to the Germans to surrender, so he would not be forced to take any more lives. With the machine guns silenced, York made his way back downhill. As he walked, a group of Germans spotted him and launched a bayonet attack. York dropped his now empty rifle and drew his pistol, a Colt 1911. He stopped next to Private Percy Beardsley, the unit's shotgunner, who also drew his Colt and began firing on the charging Germans. Drawing on his knowledge gleaned from hunting turkeys, York aimed for the rearmost German first, the idea being that if the leader was dropped, the others would scatter and be more difficult to eliminate. Working his way from the back to the front, he methodically picked off the attackers one at a time, supported by Beardsley. Some of the Germans fell back in the confusion, but one by one, they fell, until the 6th was less than 10 feet away when hit. After seeing his countrymen being killed, a German officer among the POWs who spoke English approached York, and after a brief exchange, said that he could get the remaining Germans to surrender. York agreed, and the officer blew a whistle and began shouting orders. York used him to translate instructions, and soon he, his surviving men, and a column of German POWs were on their way back to American lines. The group eventually arrived at a rear area when an officer approached York, stating, "Well, York, I hear you've captured the whole German army." York replied, "No, sir, I only have 132. During his action in silencing the machine gun and stopping the bayonet attack, York killed 25 German soldiers. Due to this feat, York was promoted to sergeant and was given the Distinguished Service Cross. In April of 1919, a review of his actions had this award upgraded to the Medal of Honor. He would also be awarded the French Croix de Guerre and several other foreign medals. After the war, York returned home to Tennessee and tried to reintegrate into the life that he had left behind. He did use his fame for charitable works, most of which focused on improving the lives of the residents of impoverished Appalachia. During the Second World War, York joined the U.S. Army Signal Corps as a major, though health complications prevented him from participating in any significant capacity. York would suffer a stroke in 1954 and spend the remaining decade of his life in failing health, passing away on September 2nd, 1964. Imagine opening a box and finding a metal paperclip that remembers its shape, bricks made from the world's most important metals, and games that twist your brain in 6 different directions. Every 3 months, the Curiosity Box delivers a hand-picked collection of science toys, illusions, and books designed to spark wonder and critical thinking. You'll also get illusion stickers, a brain-bending shirt, and a hardcover book called What is Color?, diving deep into one of science's most overlooked mysteries. Each item comes with exclusive video lessons from Michael of Vsauce, content you won't find anywhere else. Click the link now and get 25% off your first box by using our promo code, Simple History. Let your curiosity take over.